There's obviously a loss of revenue to the U.S. government on imports. Is there any kind of figure on what that looks like?
They anticipate, or they are trying to calculate that, but they think somewhere around $10 billion a year are lost revenue.
Wow.
Yeah, it's a lot of money.
Welcome to Clothing Culture, a fashion industry podcast at the intersection of technology and innovation. I'm Emily Lane.
And I'm Bret Schnitker. We speak with experts and disruptors who are moving the industry forward and discuss solutions to real industry challenges.
Clothing Culture is produced by Stars Design Group, a global design and production house with more than 30 years of experience.
Welcome back to another episode of Clothing Culture. Today, we're back at the bar talking hot topics in our industry that are, becoming almost daily conversation. Today, we're going to be talking about de minimis. De minimis. Are you excited, Bret?
Now, that sounds like a new hit record. I don't know. Yeah.
Well, de minimis has been an active conversation in our industry for the last several years because there have been companies getting away with skyway robbery, basically, under this clause. And so let's talk a little bit about the impact that de minimis has had on U.S. businesses, some of the benefits others have been able to experience, and what might change as a result of this crackdown that the government issued a statement on earlier this year.
Yeah. De minimis has kind of a history going back to 1938. That was when it was kind of enacted, and its original intent was something so trivial on imports that the government wasn't going to be bothered with. And right. I think back then it was like $8, and then in 2016 there was kind of a modernization act, and it went to $200, and then a little bit later I think it rose to about $800 or less is something that you can, under the Obama administration, that you can import without duties, and that the government just didn't want to be bothered with. They kept raising that kind of level of what international packages could come in at without really a ton of taxation.
And that makes sense. I mean, there's only so many resources available to scrutinize over every single package coming into the United States each year. Although what we have discovered in the apparel industry, that this number has risen quite significantly in the last decade as to how many packages are coming in the United States under de minimis.
Oh yeah, I think it, in years past, before people kind of figured out how to really entrepreneurially leverage the de minimis clause, you'd have about 140 million packages. So it's still, quite a few, but now it's risen to over 1 billion packages in a year.
That's astounding.
They're saying upwards of 1 million a day enter, of course, under de minimis.
Oh my gosh, wow. That's
less trivial, I would say.
Yes, absolutely. And some of that's been some clever opportunity founded by companies to kind of skate around tariffs, essentially.
Yeah, I mean, and there are certainly different points of view on this. Mm-hmm. But the whole kind of 301 act that was kind of put in place, and that's been around for quite some time too, and it allows the U.S. Trade Representation, the Office of the U.S. Trade Representation, to analyze any country that they feel is dealing in unfair trade practices, and then penalize or adjust or be able to make some action against these things that perhaps another country would unfairly be competing with us. And, certainly under the Trump administration, that section was leveraged, I think it started in 2018, against China. And it started in things like solar panels and washing machines, and then continued to expand not only from China, but into Canada, Europe, all parts of Asia, and all categories. I mean, today 301 out of China represents probably over 70% of the goods coming out of China are under this additional penalty tariff act. Right. And those penalties probably run somewhere around 7% upwards of 30 or 50%, which just recently kind of happened on some of these other products. And it's in addition to our normal tariff and or what people call duty on a particular garment or item that comes into the U.S. in our business, I would say garment. So, and certainly that provides revenue for the U.S. government. Some would argue it balances trade.
Right. Okay, so let's talk about that specifically, the economic impact that that de minimis has had. There's obviously a loss of revenue to the U.S. government on imports. Is there any kind of figure on what that looks like?
They anticipate, or they're trying to calculate that, but they think somewhere around $10 billion a year are lost revenue.
Wow.
Yeah, it's a lot of money.
Mm-hmm. And so not only does that, of course, compromise our coffers within what's available for the U.S. government, but there's also a skewed advantage, or I would say more like a competitive disadvantage for U.S. companies because of this.
Yes. I mean, when you have these retaliatory tariffs, and they're put in place traditionally to, balance trade or offset economic disadvantage. If you ask a lot of economists, they generally don't work.
Yeah.
In the long run, tariffs just don't work unless they're extremely high, where you're just shutting out a country.
Right.
And when you look at 2022 to 2023, after these things were put in place, you do see a difference, especially out of China, about a 25% reduction in our trade deficit. So a lot of people would say, hey, we were at 382 billion trade deficit with China. It's now become about 297 billion. The tariffs are working. And on its surface, you go, okay, but when you figure out how much is coming through de minimis, you realize that whenever there's a challenge, people find solutions to come at things in a different way. And when you look at de minimis and you look at the sheer volume of things that are coming through in de minimis in general, you're realizing that people are finding ways around, these retaliatory tariffs, and the imbalance certainly within the tariff and the duty world is, as importers in large volumes of goods that come into the U.S., we not only pay duties, but we pay these retaliatory tariffs. Those are not things that China pays. Those are things that the U.S. consumer pays. A lot of people are saying that the Trump tariffs are the largest taxation on American consumers ever, and that those costs do get passed along. No one just absorbs them.
Right.
They get passed along, and the consumers end up paying more for particular goods. But the offside of that is that entrepreneurial Chinese companies sit down and say, look, how do we figure out a way in the modern world to be able to be competitive? And there's this de minimis loophole where they're like, okay, I can ship things in under $800 direct to a consumer because we have online business going on. Right. It's not all built in brick and mortar anymore. And anything I ship in under $800 from me to one individual, I'm shipping it in duty free. And so there is this heavy disadvantage for people, U.S. importers versus Chinese exporters, with this whole de minimis situation.
Is there an inflationary impact at all?
Certainly with tariffs, there's an inflationary impact that consumers are paying more. Government's collecting more money, they're collecting more taxation. There might be some shift in terms of trade imbalance, but the consumer pays for it in the end.
Yeah.
The benefit that consumers see when they are buying goods from some of these larger Chinese companies direct under the de minimis rule is that there's a reduction of inflation because they're paying less for goods because they don't have to pay the government their share of import fees and taxation.
So on paper, it looks like it's better because, costs aren't rising at all. I can still get this item for the same price it cost.
And I would argue some of that whole shift in the deficit is because so much is coming in under de minimis that even though, we think on, the overall books on trade deficit, that China's deficit's down 25%. I think they're just finding ways around. I mean, shipments to Tijuana and Mexico, that whole area, were up 30% last year, because a lot of what's happening is these companies are shipping large amounts of goods into Mexico in these large warehouses, and then shipping small parcel right across the border in de minimis.
Right. Okay, so you've talked a little bit about how that creates a pressure on U.S. businesses.
Sure.
So what are some of those the key challenges there?
Certainly the difference between duties and tariffs and somebody who's not paying those. Everyone that's in the import business that goes through proper channels is going to be subject to duties and tariffs, and will pay those higher rates, and those will get passed along to the customer.
Yeah.
I think that's the biggest impact that we see.
Higher margins. Or not margins, higher costs.
Yeah.
Smaller margins
if
you're going to be competitive,
yeah,
right?
Certainly.
Yeah. Okay. So some of this is being fostered by, you mentioned it, the e-commerce growth. A lot more people are buying their products online. We saw a huge growth, of course, during COVID, which really has not waned. And I think there are some conversations that, this is even further fostering more of the health in e-commerce, and while retail experience continues to suffer. Can you talk a little bit about the impact of this whole ecosystem with e-com and the de minimis?
Yeah, I would say that we all go through cycles. In our business, specifically in the apparel business, I think that consumers still want to touch and feel items. They want to have experiential retail. And we're seeing a lot of these new concepts explode, where it's not just traditional brick and mortar retail. You might go in and have a drink, and you might see some apparel there. It's just, it becomes this whole entertainment kind of conversation. And I think that's the evolution of what we're seeing on that side. The challenges that you still have with e-commerce is returns and exchanges being at a high level, lack of control on quality in some cases. It is a community control on quality by the star rating. And we've heard some stories, obviously, about some direct imports where they haven't gone through proper testing or protocols and are causing some issues. And the community does kind of weigh in pretty heavily in case there's something they're not particularly happy with. But I think we need to continue to figure out these different ways to balance the playing field for everybody, because e-commerce isn't going away. If de minimis remains, and in September they made a big announcement that they're going to be reviewing this.
And cracking down.
Yeah, what that means, who knows? But these are things that are certainly impacting the scope, and people, even U.S. companies, certainly have the ability, if they're shipping direct to consumer and have that kind of volume, they can set up similar deals and ship directly to consumers under de minimis.
So you're talking about volume. This is a lot of volume, as you've mentioned. And we have talked about the pressure from a logistics standpoint, managing that kind of volume, and then how that dovetails into environmental challenge. We had a wonderful conversation with Mike Robinson on the last mile and all of these things, the carbon neutrality conversations, all of that. Certainly there is enhanced pressure with this volume of goods being managed direct delivery to consumer.
Sure, and it's not just de minimis that's adding to that, right? It's the whole online, you throw in Amazon and every other shipper that's shipping directly to a consumer today. We have a massive increase in packaging issues. We have a massive increase in use of all the different
boxes,
particular,
bags,
everything.
all of it.
And you have a lot more transportation on the road, delivering items to customers and also returning to main sites. So you've got a lot of carbon being used in all of these transactions, where in the past you would have maybe a more focused effort on that.
Because the cost of returns is so high, we are seeing examples of retailers saying, don't return it. Just give it to somebody else.
Yeah.
In a lot of those instances, some of those things just end up going to the landfill. So here again, we're just continuing to contribute to a bigger problem.
It's just a very complicated issue because as all businesses evolve and technology affects every aspect of our lives every day, at the same time as those challenges kind of raise, I believe there's a number of people out there that we've been talking to that are finding ways to offset some of those challenges effectively. So in the short term, we're definitely going to see those impacts environmentally. In the long term, hopefully, as we're seeing more environmentally friendly packaging, more consistent recycling efforts, more last mile consolidations and saving, those should certainly help. But we are definitely consumer nation. I don't think that's going to change anytime soon.
And we're not the only consumer nation out there.
Absolutely correct.
Yeah.
We are the largest consumer nation.
For now.
Yeah. In respect to a trade deficit annually today, I think America has the largest trade deficit of any country in the world. It's about $700, almost $800 billion.
Oh my gosh. Wow.
All countries listed. So,
holy smokes.
we like to bring in a lot more than we like to ship out.
So with that much coming in, I imagine that there's a fair amount of pressure with regards to customs.
I think that certainly some of the challenges that they're going to have as they crack down, quote, on de minimis, is how we're going to manage the sheer volume coming in. U.S. Customs is, and no planned words, but they're already taxed in terms of manpower. We've got all sorts of acts that have been put in place that they've got to be looking for. We talked a little bit about the Uyghur Act that, they've put in place in China where cotton goods have to be watched. I mean, the average customs officer is got a lot on his plate.
Right, of course. Well, that was a pretty awesome overview. Thank you. Is there anything else that people should know about de minimis now or de minimis down the road?
Yeah, I think like with everything, landscapes are going to change. There are people that have built their entire business on de minimis, and certainly they're looking for alternatives because they know the U.S. government is going to have to make some change. They're seeing these massive numbers that are not just rounding errors, that don't follow the de minimis, the reason de minimis was created, right? Something that's just not important. It's become a very important part. And I think certainly with the right lobbyists from, U.S. manufacturing organizations, understanding that we're in an unlevel playing field, that the U.S. government's going to have to step in and figure it out. But like with everything, every evolution has different solutions and different ways to affect future outcomes. So always be up to date on new rules and regulations, and be prepared for this one, I think, to be addressed.
Great. Well, thank you. And thank you for joining us on this wonderful conversation on de minimis. And don't forget to subscribe to stay apprised of upcoming episodes of Clothing Culture.